Hello there. Good morning to you, good afternoon to you, and good evening to you. To you from wherever you are watching from. So this is also continuing with our historical piece, and that is a fatherless people. The secret story of how Nigerians missed the road to the promised land. Just like I have said just before, this may sound a little bit boring, seated there and just listening to this, endless reading. But I promise you, it can also be very, very interesting, especially whenever the story touches your own supposed association to what Nigeria is today. And the purpose of this book and this reading and books like this are just to help a lot of us who are battling with identity crisis. No thanks to Nigeria, where a lot of us are battling with identity crisis. It helps. And for the generations that are here now and the generations that are coming, these two can encourage them to know more about themselves and who they are, so that when they want to stand up for or against what they have been foisted on, what has been foisted on them or forced on them, they will have a kind of, clearer understanding of why they want something different and better. And they won't be the first. Their forebearers played their parts. Our forebearers played their parts. Rightly or wrongly, we are here now. So it's ideal to have an idea of who we were before this identity crisis. We have done chapter 1 to chapter 4. So we are forging ahead to chapter 5, page 139. And if you have the chance of listening to me this morning or afternoon, wherever you are, the first thing you should please do is try and share the broadcast, so as for others to also maybe benefit from this. Another thing is that you can actually carry on with your your daily activity by just plugging this your earpiece on and pretend that you are listening to a podcast. I don't know how horrible my voice is, but people said they love the reading, and I love it too. So we have another 3 hours to ruminate through this. If time permits, we will be able to cover chapter 5, chapter 6, and then possibly maybe chapter 7. But if we can't, so that we can give room to maybe some contributions, okay? If the time permits, we can take calls, just reactions to whatever you have or you will be listening to today. So it's quite a long read. So if we can do this, that is, if we can do about 50 pages in the next 2 hours, then maybe we can take calls. So let's get to it. If you have been one of those who have been following this, you are welcome to the continuation, which is the chapter 5. a lot of the Templars are feeling like, oh, we are not seeing enough people tuning in to listen to this. And there are supposed to be more people. I'm like, don't worry yourself. There's something about content like this. If they don't appeal to majority of the present, kind of audience, or the timing is totally not, suitable for a lot to join us live, the good thing is that they will remain here forever. As long as YouTube exists, they will remain. As long as Facebook exists, they will remain. And whether it is 10 years time, 20 years time, it is a lifetime work that will always work on every generation, looking for an answer, starting with us, at least now. So let's go ahead now. And thank you once again. If you have shared this broadcast, thank you. And if you haven't, maybe you should. Because the moment I start reading now, that will be us. And you may be just seated there, glued to your screen, and then being like, wow, wow. And also, to those who are watching on Facebook and YouTube, it is also going to help if you probably let us know if the audio is perfect. Now, let us start. Chapter 5, A Fatherless People, the secret story of how Nigerians missed the road to the promised land, written and published by Dr. Dele Ogun. Chapter 5, The Hot and Cold Wars and the End of Colonialism. There never has been, there isn't now, and there never will be any race of people fit to serve as masters over their fellow men. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The aftermath of the First World War. Give me a sec. Better. The aftermath of the First World War. The beginning of the end of the slave trade started with a turn of events in the British-American relationship, climaxing in the American War of Independence. The end of colonialism, which replaced the slave trade, can also be explained by a turn of events in the same relationship. An understanding of these events is important for an understanding of the events which occurred in Nigeria, which culminated in the grant of independence on the 1st October 1960. The United States, having digested its own continental expanse, had been content to stand back from the scramble for colonies in Africa and Asia. With its own experience as the first overseas colony of the British Empire and the first to have gained independence, America understood that the underlying cause of the First World War was the business of empires. It had been a war between the halves, Britain, France, and Russia, and the have-nots, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The US's decisive intervention on the side of the colonial powers earned for it the opportunity to change the world order. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which he proclaimed on 8th January 1918, was the first indication that the end days of colonialism were nearing, but it was only a tentative signal. Point 5 was a latter-day equivalent of the first steps towards abolition of slave trade. A free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all questions of sovereignty, the interest of the populations concerned have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. A pronouncement of more significance for the future of colonialism was point 14, which introduced the idea of the League of Nations. Hitherto, the single most powerful colonial power served as the de facto ruler of the world and arbitrator of state claims. Now global sovereignty was to be pooled amongst a college of great power. The last attempt to regulate the uncivilized game of colonization had been the Berlin Conference of 1884. That effort failed because it focused simply on the regulation of the game between the main players and paid no mind to the interest of the have-nots, let alone the interest of the colonized. In, again, simply focusing on the ground rules of the game to be observed by the colonial powers and on punishing and reforming the conduct of the defeated powers. The terms of the peace agreement struck at the at Versailles in 1919 left the door open for a repeat of history. Those peace terms had stripped Germany of the few colonies in Africa that Bismarck had acquired by turning these territories into League of Nations mandated territories to be administered by Britain and France. In this modern application of the parable of the talents, the haves received a distribution of more colonial territory from the have-nots. It was a focus on the outward manifestation of an ambition at the expense of an understanding of what was driving that ambition. One man on whom the lesson was not lost was Adolf Hitler. Writing from his prison cell in 1924, Hitler saw the land and colonial question which had led to the First World War as unfinished business. In his view, Germany had too small a portion of the earth's land to be considered a great power. So this is what Hitler wrote from inside his prison cell in 1924 concerning this subject of the haves and the have-nots. In an era when the earth is gradually being divided up among the states, some of which embrace almost entire continents, we cannot speak of a world power in connection with a formation whose political mother country is limited to the absurd area of 500,000 square meters or kilometers rather. From the territorial point of view, the area of the German Reich vanishes completely as compared with the so-called world powers. Let no one cite England as a proof to the contrary, for England in reality is merely the great capital of the British World Empire, which calls nearly a quarter of the earth's surface its own. In addition, we must regard as giant states, first of all, the American Union, then Russia and China. All are spatial formations having in part, an area more than 10 times greater than the present German Reich. Thus, in the world today, we see a number of power states, some of which not only far surpass the strength of our German nation in population, but whose area, above all, is the chief support of their political power. It was a matter of time before the German war machine broke free of the shackles placed on it by the Versailles Treaty. When the time came, all that could be done was to fall back upon horrid attempts at appeasement. The envelope which Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain waved on his return from Munich when he proclaimed peace in our time is believed to have contained an agreement that Germany's former colonies would be returned together with the transfer of Nigeria to the Germans. The deal failed. It was not to West Africa that Hitler was looking to satisfy the German nation's hunger for land. It must be said that such a territorial policy cannot be fulfilled in the Cameroons, but today, almost exclusively in Europe. We must therefore coolly and objectively adopt the standpoint that it can certainly not have been the intention of heaven to give one people 50 times as much land and soil in this world as another. In this case, we must not let political boundaries obscure for us the boundaries of eternal justice. If this earth really has room for all to live in, let us be given the soil we need for our livelihood. True, they will not willingly do this, but then the law of self-preservation goes into effect. And what is refused to amicable methods, it is up to the feast to take. This was Hitler when he was offered Africa, part of Africa, in his, in the Germans' anger that the people called the world power, Britain, France, they have 50 times the land that the Germans have. So, in order to sort of appease him, they said they will give him Nigeria. If not, you and I today probably will be speaking German. Again, all the process of how our identities got stolen, destroyed, and a lot of us were left confused with the identity of one Nigeria. Like I said before, if Lugard had named this same geographical expression called Nigeria today, if he had named it Lugard, all of them are going to answer Lugardians today. But if they have sold us to Hitler and the Germans prevented the Second World War, so today a lot of you will not be beholden to England. We will be beholden to Germany. So you can see how they are like trading us, but Hitler was not interested in the Cameroon or Nigeria. He was more interested in the land in Europe. So that was why the deal failed. But let us continue. On the 1st September 1939, history duly repeated itself when the Second World War started with Germany's invasion of Poland in furtherance of Hitler's policies of looking to Eastern Europe to seize the land that Germany wanted. The new war, which touched every continent and consumed more than 100 million lives, saw a new lineup of halves: Britain, France, Russia, China, and their allies pitted against the have-nots, led by Germany, Japan, and Italy. There was a tragic irony in the fact that this war between the self-acclaimed civilized nations of the world was to draw in large quantities the human and material resources of those who they were competing to civilize. The story of the Yoruba man, Isaac Fadoyebo, one of the 100,000 or so African troops who the British deployed to fight the Japanese in the rainforest of Burma during the war, was but one of many. A new American Declaration of Independence. To begin with, the United States was, once again, able to stand back from the conflict by the cycle of history was completed, but the cycle of history was completed when the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, traveled to America to make a plea for America to repeat the rescue mission of the First World War by entering the war against Nazi Germany. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, mostly pronounced as Roosevelt, had brought America out of the Great Depression with his New Deal economic program. But it was in the field of foreign affairs that his greatness was to become manifest. He was astute in realizing that the First World War had ended without any clear vision of the principles upon which the world was to live in peace after the war. Guided by the shortcomings in President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point, he was determined not to repeat the mistake of failing to secure a clear agreement on the shape of the new post-war order before committing American lives to the war. So, he wrote, leaving to one side for the moment the fact that Nazism is hateful and that our natural interest, our hearts, are with the British. But there is another angle. We have got to make it clear to the British from the very outset that we don't intend to be simply a good time Charlie who can be used to help the British Empire out of a tight spot and then be forgotten forever. The discussion between the American president and the British Prime Minister over the future of the British Empire is interesting. Roosevelt, this is now the historical record or recorded conversation between Roosevelt and Churchill. Roosevelt, I can't believe that we can fight a war against fascist slavery, and at the same time not work to free people all over the world from a backward colonial policy. Churchill responded, what about the Philippines? Roosevelt, I'm glad you mentioned them. They get their independence, in 1946. And they've been gotten modern sanitation, modern education. Their rate of illiteracy has gone steadily down. Churchill cuts in. That there can be no tampering with the empire's economic agreements. Roosevelt, they are artificial. Churchill, they are the foundation of our greatness. Roosevelt, the peace cannot include any continued despotism. The structure of the peace demands and will get equality of peoples. Equality of peoples involves the utmost freedom of competitive trade. Churchill, Mr. President, I believe you are trying to do away with the British Empire. Every idea you entertain about the structure of the post-war world, demonstrate it. But in spite of that, we know that you constitute our only hope And you know that we know it. You know that we know that without America, the empire won't stand. In the New Deal for the post-war world that was recorded in the terms of the Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt and Churchill signed on 14th August 1941, there was to be no place for colonialism. The charter committed the signatory powers to respect the rights of the people to choose the form of government under which they will live, and that they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Even so, it was simply a declaration of intent. The procedure and timescale by which the colonial states were to be granted their independence had still to be worked out. What Roosevelt envisaged was that at the end of the war, the United Nations would replace the colonial powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, as the arbiters of the national interest of their colonial subjects. They would effectively hold their colonies on trust under a mandate from the United Nations by which they will be charged with the responsibility of bringing education, raising standards of living, improving the health conditions of all the backward, depressed colonial areas of the world. The decision on whether any colony was ready for independence was to have been taken out of the interested hands of the colonial powers and placed with the United Nations as a whole. That none of this happened was the result of a twist of fate that saw President Roosevelt died on 12th April 1945, just weeks before the German surrender on 7th May 1945. With Roosevelt gone, the defenders of the old world order took rapid steps to ensure that the vision was buried quickly with the man. The winds of change that Roosevelt had whipped up with the Atlantic Charter suddenly died. The Cold War and the Vietnam War. Warrior nations need enemies, and if there is none, they must create one for it. They must create one, for it is the source of their internal strength and unity. Britain is before anything else a warrior nation. Thus, even before the final surrender of Germany, for which the three great powers, Britain, America, and the USSR, had pooled blood, sweat, and tears to achieve new battle lines were being drawn between Britain and America on the one side, and the new enemy, the USSR. Roosevelt's war against imperialism, the war to end all wars, was relegated to the background by those in charge of US foreign policy. In fact, the fear of communism became the strongest argument in favor of the need to slow the wind of decolonization. This remarkable U-turn in American foreign policy towards colonialism that Churchill managed to pull off left the field open for Russia to assume the mandate of the champion of the free world and anti-colonial crusader. Anthony Eden summed up the situation as he flew to Washington in 1956 to make a fresh appeal for America to line up on the British side in the new war, the Cold War against Russia, and the defense of colonialism. The visit of Marshal Bourgani and Mr. Khrushchev to India and Burma had not helped us. Western leadership had been put on the defensive by the anti-colonial manifesto. They had flourished there. It was necessary that we and the United States should draw closer together on this prickly topic and find words to express a common philosophy. With Roosevelt gone and with America now lined up against the new enemy, the British Empire had a new lease of life. However, it was to prove only a short reprieve before differences between Britain and America over war strategy to help France keep hold of its colony, French Indochina, Vietnam, led the Americans to serve a final and formal notice on the British and the French to dismantle their colonial empires. The American administration under Dwight D. Eisenhower had been proceeding on the basis that the new common enemy was communism in all its manifestations. When that enemy, with the active sponsorship of communist China, surfaced in Vietnam to drive the French out, Eisenhower expected British support for intervention, knowing that that support was vital for the administration's hope to get US congressional approval for the deployment of US troops. The larger strategic objective for the Americans appears to have been to gain a foothold in Southeast Asia for any future war against China. For its part, while the Churchill government was keen on American help to contain communist influence in Europe, it was less enthusiastic over the prospect of the Americans gaining influence in Southeast Asia. When Churchill withheld British support for the American intervention, the Eisenhower administration saw this as a grave betrayal. The Americans, having gone too far with their planning and too public with their agenda, now found themselves having to go into Vietnam alone. The change in the attitude of the Eisenhower administration toward Britain and France was swift. To the Chinese slogan, Asia for the Asians, the United States was now resolved to add Arabia for the Arabs and Africa for the Africans, and indeed Europe for the Europeans. It was intended as a reminder to Churchill of just how much Britain still depended on America in his renewed claim to be a major player on the world stage. Harold Macmillan was in no doubt about the altered state of the power relationship between Britain and America, and he wrote, "Perhaps the most noticeable and painful difference between our position now and when we were last in office, 1945, is our relationship to US. Then we were on an equal footing, a respected ally. Then it was the Churchill-Roosevelt combination or its aftermath. Now we are treated by the Americans with a mixture of patronizing pity and contempt. They treat us worse than they do any country in Europe. They undermine our political and commercial influence all over the world." Britain's role in the creation of the State of Israel on 14th May 1948, immediately upon the British mandate for Palestine coming to an end, had already ignited the fuse of anti-colonialism in the Middle East. Egypt and the Suez crisis was where the United States was to show that there was to be no turning back, this time around from its renewed resolve to dismantle the British Empire. Under the terms of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 that had been entered into in the run-up to the Second World War, Britain had been permitted to use the Suez Canal zone as its main military base in the region. The war having since ended, the priority for the Arab states was to get the remaining British forces in the zone out of the area. The Egyptians sought to do this in 1951 by unilaterally revoking the treaty. The British retaliated by taking early steps to decouple Sudan from Egypt by announcing their plan to introduce self-government for Sudan with effect from 1st January 1956. This was the opportunity for the Americans to wade in on Egypt's side in its bid to be formally unified with Sudan under the rule of their king Farouk, only for Farouk's reign to come to a sudden and dramatic end when he was ousted from power by a military coup led by Colonel Abdul Nasir on the 23rd July 1952. If the new American policy towards the British Empire had been unstated previously, it became clearer to Churchill and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, as they were preparing to fly to Washington on 24th June 1954. Before leaving England, the Prime Minister and I had read a report from Washington of a meeting between Mr. Dulles, American Secretary of State, and some leading American journalists. According to an account which our embassy thought reliable, the Secretary of State had declared his conviction that American policy in the Middle East, as well as in Asia, had been badly handicapped by a tendency to support British and French colonial views. He was reported to have spoken of his determination to talk bluntly about the Middle East and of his aim to shift policies. It was against the backdrop of this altered geopolitical landscape that negotiations with the newly confident Nasser-led Egypt led to an agreement in July 1954, providing for the removal of all British troops from the Suez Canal in 1956. The British attempt to get the Egyptians to participate in the Middle East Defense Organization, which Britain was trying to put in place in anticipation of the planned final withdrawal of his troops from the Canal Zone, failed when Nasser insisted that the troop withdrawal must be completed before he would even discuss the plan. On 26 July 1956, Nasser now moved to nationalize the Suez Canal. This being the main artery of the Middle East oil supplies to Western Europe, it was an attack on the very jugular of the colonial powers. Coming on the back of the Iranian nationalization of British oil interests, and with Nasser's general anti-colonial rhetoric, this was the defining challenge to the future of European empires. The British quickly rallied their fellow colonial powers, France and the Netherlands, to meet the challenge. The plan was for concerted action through the United Nations, if possible, and for direct military actions if necessary. Meanwhile, the USSR, in keeping with its new mantle as the champion of anti-colonialism, stood behind Egypt. The outcome of the standoff would, once again, depend on which side the United States chose to come down on. Without American backing for military action by the colonial powers, Nasser could make his moves with confidence. He had already rejected the compromise proposals which had been put forward by the 18-nation committee that the United Nations appointed to look into the matter. Everything now turned upon how he would respond to the alternative proposals of the Canal Users Club, which had been brokered by the Americans themselves. When the Americans made a public announcement ruling out the use of force to resolve the issue, Eden said, in quote, the words were an advertisement to Nasser that he could reject the project with impunity, off quote. This was precisely what Nasser did. As the American administration had done over Vietnam, the British government had gone too far with its own preparation over Egypt and too public with its threat of action to pull back without complete loss of face. The British and French preparations for the military action to take back the canal had been underway since July 1956, and had only been held back by the process of referral to the United Nations, which the Americans had engineered. It was therefore more than just coincidence when, on 27th October 1956, Israel invaded Egypt, and the British and French forces quickly used the opportunity to take control of the Canal Zone. The United States government was not deceived. The US Vice President, Richard Nixon, responded by using the platform of the United Nations to make a formal announcement of America's break from British and French colonial policies. And this is what Nixon said. For the first time in history, we have shown independence of Anglo-French policies towards Asia and Africa, which seemed to us to reflect the colonial tradition. This declaration of independence has had an electrifying effect throughout the world. This American Declaration of Independence in relation to foreign affairs was to have a dramatic impact on the course of history in Africa and Asia. To begin with, the British set out to defy the United States. However, their Achilles heel was too well known to the Americans, who at this time were still bankrolling the European post-war economic revival and the reconstruction efforts with their Marshall Plan of financial aid. Knowing the financial vulnerability of the British, it was a simple enough measure to launch economic warfare against Britain to bring it to heel. A run on the pound at a speed which threatened disaster to our old economic position had developed in the world's financial markets. Harold Macmillan, Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, wrote in his diary on 25th September 1956, "The state of our reserves and the pressure on sterling made me very anxious. If this situation goes on too long, it may well overcome us, and we be driven to devaluation or bankruptcy. It is all very sad, because apart from Suez, we were really beginning to make real progress." A ceasefire was quickly declared on 6 November 1956, followed by United Nations resolutions demanding the withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli forces from Egypt. The withdrawal of British troops was completed on 23rd December 1956. The Americans had now retrieved the crown of champions of anti-colonialism from the Soviet Union. They were in no mood to allow the British and the French to sleep on the job of liquidating the colonial empires. This was the unseen background to the spate of independence ceremonies which followed across the globe. However, this would not be the first time that the end of the British Empire had been proclaimed, only for those who had come to witness its burial to discover that it had found new life. Churchill, in his old age, had no heart for decolonization. His foreign secretary, Eden, proved to be a complacent gradualist. Only Harold Macmillan, Minister of Defense, seemed to have some sort of vision of moving forward a third British Empire. That is the end of chapter 5, A Fatherless People. So we're going to go on to chapter 6, but I am going to take a tea break. And yes, if you have joined us, it is that same reading. You know what I mean? It is the same reading, the reading of A Fatherless People. The secret story of how Nigerians missed the road to the promised land. I have no idea what the promised land is or was. I am interested in finding where that was, because So far, so good. I have had clarity to show to me that, give me a second, that shows to me that this contraption shouldn't even have existed if not for the selfishness of the British colonialists who formed a country based on their own business interests, economic interests, economic exploitation of the people living in that space. They decided that one Nigeria, which is the British vision, one Nigeria is British dream for Nigeria. It is not Nigerians' dream, because in truest sense of it, there is nobody that is a Nigerian. All right, because we all know that since if we begin to kind of dig it like we are doing now, we are very much clearer that we would have possibly done well for ourselves if they didn't fuse us together, even colonized, right? These were countries on their own, different cultures, different background. You force your religions, Arab religion, what do you call it? British religion. You force all of them on us, force to change our language, force us to be shouting one Nigeria when it is so obvious that we have nothing in common. It has never worked, it will never work, and this is why. Remember that. So let us continue now to chapter 6 and see how much time we can save. That one is an extensive one, okay? It's a very long one. So we better get down, we better get to it right now. So and see if we are going to be able to take calls. Yeah, 50 pages. We've only just done about, 4, 5. We've only done about 10 pages out of 50. See, we still have a long way to go. Now, if you are joining us as you are waking up this morning, I'm like, oh, is this live? It is live if you are joining us this moment. But the moment you can see that it's recorded, you will see that it's recorded. But this one is live, it's obvious. Look at the screen, right? So let us now go on, please. Chapter 6, the Babylon mask. It really begins to look more like, more than likely that our likable, lazy northerner will be handed over to the tender mercies of the southern trousered apes within a few years. It is a deplorable prospect, but Abubakar Tafawa Balewa is almost playing a lone hand in our defense. Robert Hepburn Wright. The educated natives challenge to the demigods of empire was a modern rerun of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It was to be dealt with in the same way by the promotion of confusion and disunity amongst the people. The divide between northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria ran so deep that it reflected in the character and attitudes of the colonial administrators themselves, to the point that it was said that if all Nigerians had withdrawn from the country, there would have been a civil war between the two groups of Europeans. The colonial administrators who were posted to the north loved the people and their ways and resented the south and their peoples as much as their native words. Listen to this. One of them wrote, I had asked in London if I might be posted to the northern provinces of Nigeria rather than to the south. The north seemed to me to resemble far more closely the northern India that I had known. It was predominantly Muslim, and it had a lingua franca, Hausa, that, like the India Urdu, could be spoken fluently by Europeans. Finally, it was us country and would be, I thought, a far freer and more unfettered place in which to live than the forest-clothed south. Similarly, those who were posted to the south fell in love with the southerners and shared a contempt for the lazy northerners and their ways with their southern words. So one of those posted to the south wrote about the north. The British in the north despised the educated Igbo and Yoruba from the south, but nevertheless, they had to employ them as clerks, storekeepers, and railwaymen in the north, as there were no educated northerners. They were seen as troublemakers, like the missionaries, the sort of people who see injustice everywhere and protest to the newspapers. Do you see how they shaped this bigotry? How your colonial masters, supposed civilized people, you see how they planted the seed of this bigotry, the seed of this hatred. They were putting all of this in their report. And those are the real pictures of how we see ourselves today. An average southerner will tell you, our northerners are illiterate, they are lazy, they are this or that. So it didn't start today. Southerners, oh, they are arrogant, they are wearing trousers, any small thing, they will quickly jump to the newspapers and all of that. Wow. Wow. Let us continue. A clandestine war against the educated natives would endure in one form or another up to and beyond independence in 1960. That the Lugardists' views about the intrinsic inadequacies of these natives was nothing more than self-serving rhetoric is clear from their actions, which brought about the country's failure. The scheme was rolled out in stages over a period of 40 years from Lugard's recall from Nigeria in 1919 to Nigeria's independence elections in 1959. In this battle, the colonial administrators in the north held all the aces given the British government's determination to hold on to Nigeria, especially in the face of new and significant threats to the empire, which had arisen before, during and after the Second World War. Just as slavery became unsustainable after both sides in the American War of Independence enlisted the help of those they had previously subjugated, so too the appeal by the colonial powers to their colonial subjects for help during the war had begun to undermine the imperial hold. The following was a public appeal issued by the colonial government on 3rd September 1939. The British government at home will want all the produce it can get from this country, such as palm produce, groundnuts, cotton, etc. And the prices of these are likely to rise. Every farmer will find that it will pay him to grow more and more of them. And however much he grows, he may be certain of a market and feel that he is doing what he can to help win the war. With the Japanese having captured British Singapore and pressing hard on British Burma, and with British India in their sights, the empire had come full circle from the American War of Independence. Once again, it found itself offering the promise of freedom to its captives, collectively now rather than individually, in return for their support in its moment of extremis. Such a retreat by the empire on one flank could not be kept secret for long from the other flanks of the empire. Having been bombarded throughout the war with appeals to make sacrifices for the fight against fascism and for the cause of liberty and democracy, the educated natives had high expectations of change after the war was won. With knowledge of the challenges that had been thrown down to the empire in India, in Iran, and then in Egypt. And with encouraging noises from the Russians and American governments, they began to organize themselves for a dash towards colonial freedom. The Yoruba were singled out as the main troublemakers, who were already following the example of the Hindus in India. In one of their records, they wrote, "It is among the Yorubas that Christian missionary propaganda has obtained most of its converts in West Africa. With Christian missionary teaching, Western education, or more accurately, and generally semi-education, and indifferent at that, has, of course, gone hand in hand, and it is amongst the Yorubas almost exclusively, so far as southern Nigeria is concerned, that the problem of the educated native and what his part is to be in the future of the country arises and threatens to become acute." Their potential trouble had been demonstrated towards the end of the First World War, with the joint uprising of the Egba and Owu tribes, which had engaged the colonial army in an internal war for 6 weeks. Before the Second World War, a key part of the containment strategy had been to keep the Yorubas out of the Nigerian army. But then the exigencies of the war effort dictated otherwise. Army life was not confined to white troops. More than 100,000 Nigerians served in the military forces during the war. The two divisions, with more than 30,000 men, had experience in the Middle East, East Africa, Burma, and India. It is therefore not surprising to find ex-servicemen among the more militant leaders of the nationalist movement during the post-war period. With freedom of assembly and speech severely curtailed at home, the best place to exercise it was in the very bosom of the empire itself, in Britain. It is no coincidence that most of the efforts to awaken respect for and appreciation of African culture started among African students abroad. Also, while abroad, students could observe the white man as he actually is: stupid and intelligent, cruel and kind, evil and virtuous, filthy and immaculate, irrational and rational, and thus become aware of the universalities of human nature and behavior, the doctrine of white superiority, and with it, the justification for imperial rule, was crushed by their devastating critique of the white man as he is versus the pretentiousness of his ideas. The nationalists, armed with the direct experiences of the war sacrifices that had been made by their people, and with learning acquired from British educational institutions like the Inns of Court, School of Law, and through interaction with Indian students in Britain, a few of the educated natives now emerge as frontline activists in a formal campaign for Nigerian independence. There were many in number, these were many in number, but 4 in particular were the lead actors. These 4 were H.O. Davis, Obafemi Awolowo, Anthony Enahoro, and Nnamdi Azikiwe. Each of the 4 was brilliant in his own way and could have made competent leaders of the country, but none of them ever did. At varying times, they were on the same side, and at other times, they were at war with one another. All had a background in journalism. 2 were Yoruba, 1 a Lagosian, the other Ijebu. 1 was Edo, and the 4th was Igbo. 2 had come through serious financial challenges from a young age, including long bouts of unemployment. 2 would be tried and jailed for treason. Each would encounter Miss Margaret Peram, Lugard's biographer, at an early stage in their political journey. Their story in the struggle for independence for Nigeria is as much the story of their personal and ideological struggles with one another as with the British. So, Ezekiah Oladipo Davis, born in Lagos, his name at birth was Ezekiah Oladipo Ogunmade. His grandfather, Prince Ogunmade of the Ogunmade Royal House of Lagos, had been a witness to the ceremony at which King Josemo had ceded Lagos to the British in 1861. For this reason, he had a special attachment to issues concerning the political future of Lagos. Davis' education epitomized the problem that those concerned with the longevity of the empire had with the system of education in southern Nigeria. There was little that was beyond his intellect. Having shown an early gift in mathematics, he was appointed as an assistant master at the prestigious King's College to teach math. In 1925, he was the only student who passed in Nigeria, possibly in West Africa, the matriculation examination for admission to the University of London. He almost invariably finished first in the order of merit in examinations, from the higher civil service entrance examination to his first degree as a Bachelor of Commerce from the London School of Economics. So his second degree in law from the same university before gaining admission to the English bar in 1946, a gifted writer. After a period of work in the Secretariat of Northern Nigeria in Kaduna, from 1926 to 1930, he had first planned to pursue a career in journalism before later deciding to pursue a career in law. He was a pioneer in several of the institutions that were to play a key role in the independence struggle, including the trade union movement, the Lagos Youth Movement, later named the Nigerian Youth Movement. He was editor of the movement's newspaper, the Daily Service, and had a leading role with the Nigerian Morning Post and the Sunday Post. A Wesleyan, he served in the First Republic government from the 1960 to 1964 as Federal Minister of State in the Ministry of Industries. His commitment to the One Nigeria ideal was total and without reservation. All sectional ideology was anathema to him, whether it came from the Hausa Fulani, the Igbos, or his own Yoruba people, or indeed the British. He would entertain any form of rule, democratic, military, feudal, provided he stood any chance of preserving Nigeria as configured by Lugard. Let all who wish to destroy the unity of Nigeria realize that it is the common heritage of 32 million people. Our fathers throughout the country toiled and suffered together in those harsh pioneering days to build up Nigeria from a geographical expression. Citizens of Nigeria in the remote part of the country are today nourished by the sacrifice of our fathers who died toiling for Nigeria as one country. As co-messengers, laborers, etc., we therefore owe a duty to preserve such hard-won unity for generations yet unborn. Balak. While studying in London, he found aspiration for the one nation, one people, regardless of religious and linguistic differences, ideology, in the philosophy of the Congress Party of India. In 1935, the Indian students in the college invited me to join them in welcoming Pandit Jawahar Nehru. The most exciting event of the day was Pandit Nehru's address, which held every listener spellbound. He told the audience that he had come direct from jail on his way to Switzerland to see his ailing wife. All good citizens in India were in jail, and no Indian worthy of his nationality was outside the jail. And he said, isn't India itself one large British jail? One thing is certain and incontrovertible. It is a question of time for India to become independent and be left alone to direct his own affairs according to his own will. That was what Pandit Nehru said that got H.O. Davis spellbound and wanted the same for Nigeria. His steadfast commitment to one Nigeria led him to become a useful ally of fellow travelers, especially in the articulation of policy. Many of the turnings in Nigeria's political journey were presaged by him, but with uncanny precision in several of his writings and speeches. For example, an article of his, Lagos Won't Be No Man's Land, in the Daily Times of 5th June 1956. Baba, the word Lagos is no man's land, or Lagos will never be no man's land. I might not be new to know. Since 1950s, it has actually occurred, probably for the first time in the publication. And this man who is promoting one Nigeria and was one of the 4 arrowhead that got Nigeria independence process started, he wrote something about Lagos won't be no man's land in the Daily Times of 5th of June 1956. He wrote, Lagos is not an unoccupied arid desert. It is the land of the Lagosians, most of whom have no other homes and who live in Lagos. If the present tendency to untouchy, they call it untouchy, in the regions continues, then the Lagosians will soon demand that another site be found elsewhere for the federal capital. Surely, there must be some spot far away from Lagos where the east, the west, and the north have common boundaries. It is there that these autonomous regions with residual powers should meet and jointly chant the chorus: East for Easterners, West for Westerners, North for Northerners, and the devil take the rest. 20 years later, in 1976, a decision to move the federal capital from Lagos to Abuja was taken and justified on the basis of Abuja's unique quality as a place where the East, the West, and the North have common boundaries. A significant number of other such prescient contributions suggest that H.O. Davis either had the ears of those in power or they had his ears. Either way, neither jail nor exile was ever his portion at any stage of his political career. Under his stewardship, the objective of the Nigerian youth movement was to be a truly national movement with a constructive nationalist agenda that would ordinarily have made all but the most ardent imperialists comfortable. The aim of the movement was the development of a united nation out of the conglomeration of the people who inhabit Nigeria. We will combat vigorously all such tendencies that will jeopardize the unifying process, he wrote. Obafemi Jeremiah Awolowo, born on 6th March 1909 in rural Ikene in Ijebu-Remo, Yoruba land. His family lineage had been wholly traditional until the arrival of the Christian faith in Ikene in 1906, when his father became one of the first converts. Notwithstanding his grandmother, who was the biggest influence on him, in his early years, remained an Ifa worshipper. The death of his father, a successful farmer and timber merchant, in 1920, when he was just 11 years old, saw him transformed from a young boy with a comfortable upbringing and with an assured educational future into an Oliver Twist-like character in the service of various masters in Abeokuta in desperate quest for a means to pay his way through school to fulfill his late father's ambition for him to become a teacher or a clerk. In the course of this shepherd period of my young life, I attended 4 schools, namely Ibara Anglican, Ogbe Wesleyan, Itesi Wesleyan, and Itesi Roman Catholic. In the same period, my clothes were reduced almost to tatters and rags. And there was a brief period when all I had for a decent apparel was a pair of shorts and a shirt. Awolowo wrote, this experience would have fed into his decision as premier of the Western region to introduce free education for all school children. Fiercely competitive in all things, he had excelled in wrestling and as a center forward in football in his youth. The passion for competition extended to academics and made him instinctively hostile to anything that might suggest an acceptance of a status of inferiority to any man, white or black. His virulent hostility to colonial rule meant that he could not bring himself to work for the colonial administration. Work as a journalist with the Nigerian Daily Times was only a means to an end. That end being a career in law. On the journey, he tried his hand at various commercial ventures, ranging from money lending, transportation, and cocoa trading, experiencing boom and bust along the way before the award of a contract to supply the army barracks in the West and in Kaduna with yam and yam flour finally enabled him to embark on his law studies in the UK. For Awolowo, the political unity of his Yoruba people was his first priority. While in London studying law, he copied Nnamdi Azikiwe's initiative in forming the Igbo Federal Union to establish the Yoruba Cultural Organization, Egbe Omo Oduduwa, which he then brought back to Nigeria on his return in 1948. Later, in 1951, he took the initiative of launching the first modern political party in Nigeria with the Action Group, complete with party manifestos and professional electoral campaigns. His philosophy for Nigeria was shaped by his one nation outlook for the Yoruba people. His commitment was to a united Nigeria rather than one Nigeria. And so he was implacably opposed to a unitary Nigeria. He was equally hostile to a federal arrangement which was unbalanced, whether because some of the federating units were much larger than others, or because the federating units were too small to effectively balance the power of the center. He insisted upon true federalism, with the federating units being organized on the basis of their ethnic identities or linguistic ties. Awolowo wrote, Nigeria is a country of various tribes, some of which have lived together in harmony for many years before the advent of the British. Some were unknown to one another in the past and were only brought together for the first time by the British administration. Some share similar customs, traditions, and culture, and are traceable to the same ethnic origin, while others differed from each other as aborigines of Australia from the Zulu of South Africa. In dividing Nigeria into regions, it is therefore necessary to group together only people who, through affinity or general experience, are known to be capable of working together harmoniously. The guiding principles in the division of the country into regions must therefore be ethnic classification, cultural affinity, common problems, and perhaps administrative convenience. This position was the polar opposite of the British outlook for post-colonial Nigeria. His thinking on the issue, coupled with his education and his dogged commitment to principle, made him the most feared and at the same time the most respected of the nationalists in British circles. He would end up in jail on charges of high treason. Anthony Eronsile Enahoro. Anthony Enahoro was the youngest and physically the smallest of the quartet. What he lacked in age and size, he made up in his pre-consciousness, something like that. His grievance against British colonial rule was personal. He alone, amongst the quartet, was able to claim descent from a first-tier ruling family, the Benin royal family. In the course of the British conquest of Benin, his great-grandfather had been killed. His grandfather, Okoje, was captured by the British as a young man and exiled by them on no less than 3 occasions during his lifetime. Enahoro, upon the death of Overami, Okoje was returned from exile to resume the stool of his fathers, although he was to be exiled twice again to Benin and Ibadan before he died, full of years, in his own home in 1944. Now he was the current Onoje of Uromi, only recently returned from his last exile, an old man with the fire of rebellion still in his veins, never to be fully reconciled to British rule. The young Enahoro grew up on tales of his grandfather, Okoje. This great man, my boyhood hero and God, whom the wicked British had orphaned, captured after battle and exiled 3 times from his grandmother. He had made an early resolution to find a way to get even. His father's conversion to Catholicism did little to quench the fire of rebellion and vengeance which he had inherited. That fire was being unwittingly stoked on a daily basis as he fulfilled his duty of reading the newspapers to his mother while she went about her chores. Although born in Uromi, in Benin country, he had been raised in Owo, Yoruba land, from his infancy before attending King's College in Lagos for his secondary education. His first language was, therefore, Yoruba. His father's plan was that he should study for the bar, and so he had him tutored to the highest level in English. But the rebel child had his own plans. On finishing at King's College, he decided to go into journalism as the shortest route to the career in politics, on which his mind was set. So, Enahoro wrote, perhaps in preparing me as a thought for college, Father had over-prepared me, and the additional 6 years at King's had made me a man before my time. So that I believed that I was fairly well equipped for adult life. Howbeit, while some of my colleagues dreamt of great careers at the bar and others had visions of themselves as brilliant surgeons, and others had already applied to enter the civil service with its security and better wage prospects, I saw myself as a crusader, setting wrongs right, denouncing injustice, changing the world, building a new life for our people. He joined Azikiwe's West African pilot in 1943 before becoming editorial chair of his sister paper, the Southern Nigeria Defender. At the age of just 21, he was appointed editor of a leading publication, the Daily Comet, one of the ones he had been reading to his mother. As a young political activist, he found himself coming under the influence of the three older nationalists in different ways. He cut his teeth in journalism in Azikiwe's stables, while he received his early political influence from H.O. Davis as a member of one of the young circles which Davis organized. Initially impressed by Davis' one Nigeria philosophy, in the end, it was Awolowo's ethnic federalism that won him over. The combination of Awolowo and Enahoro would make the action group a formidable political force. Enahoro's battle with the British and later with the political order that the British left behind would see him repeatedly jailed for sedition before being forced into exile on 2 occasions after. His 1963 flight to Britain on a first round of exile, following charges of high treason, saw him detained in Brixton prison. The debate in the British Parliament over the Nigerian government's demand for his extradition not only filled the front pages of the British newspapers, it caused a permanent change in Britain's extradition laws. Such was the political storm that blew up over the extradition of this small yet extraordinary man that it led to the fall of the conservative government of the day, notwithstanding that the extradition request was only granted on the strict condition that the death penalty would not be imposed. Benjamin Nnamdi Azikiwe. On the individual life and experiences of the quartet before they entered national politics, Nnamdi Azikiwe was the hardest and the most moving. His story is an African tragedy of epic proportions. A man of great potential who set out to do the best for himself and for all Africans, but whose judgment calls at critical junctions led to disastrous consequences for his Igbo people. Azikiwe was an Igbo man who was born in Zungeru, Hausa land, on 16 November 1904. His father was a clerk in the West African Frontier Force, one of the educated Southerners on whose support the British administration of the North depended. As a result, Nnamdi Azikiwe was a Southerner who spent his childhood in the North. He was, to all intent and purposes, a Hausa boy. Speaking that language very fluently. At the age of 8, his father sent him to their native Onitsha to learn the Igbo tongue. At the age of 10, he was moved again to Lagos, following his father's transfer there. Now, he was being raised as a Yoruba youth of the Lagosian kind. Now, this is what Nnamdi Azikiwe wrote himself. In Bamboshe streets, we also lived near the Akereles. John, the eldest of the popular contractor, was very kind. Up to that time, I had not met any boy who was such a humanitarian during my stay in Bamboshe Street. His 3 brothers, Alaba, Oni, and Abiola, were real Aguda products. I do not say this in derision, but I mean that they were the life of our neighborhood, and they made things hot for boys who were not strong enough to resist the affront and bullying pranks of other Aguda boys. Nnamdi Azikiwe wrote in his own memoir. His close friendship with a Yoruba youth in the neighborhood by the name of Francis Adedayo Alaba, an assistant head printer of the CMS Press in Lagos, implanted in him an early interest in the printing industry. I went so far as to tell him that with his knowledge of printing, we could start a newspaper. In Lagos, Azikiwe attended the Wesleyan Boys High School in Broad Street, Lagos. After a year, his father sent him back to Onitsha to be raised as a young Igbo man. Continuing his education at CMS Central School there. By the time Azikiwe had finished the first stage of schooling, he had to support his mother. He had divorced his father after the latter took a second wife. So he took up an appointment at the school. At the age of 16, his father once again directed him to relocate to Calabar to enroll at the Hope Waddell Institute, there to resume his education. At the institute, he became exposed to the story of Liberia, then the only independent state in West Africa, from Liberians teaching there, and also from the writings of Marcus Garvey. The next stage of his educational odyssey, as directed by his father, was to return to the Wesleyan Boys High School in Lagos as a boarder. This eclectic socio-cultural upbringing extended to his religious exposure as well. So, Azikiwe wrote, as a Christian, I have been many-sided denominationally due to chance and circumstance. At the tender age of mine, I was a Catholic. At 10, I became an Anglican. At 12, I was a Methodist. At 16, I became a Presbyterian. At 18, I was a soldier of the Lord, hallelujah, in the Salvation Army. At 19, I left the emotional for the intellectual side of Christianity and became a student Bible expositor, now known as a Jehovah's Witness. At 21, I entered the Baptist fold. At 25, I was reaffirmed in the Presbyterian faith. Whilst attending service at Tinubu Methodist Church during his second stint at Wesleyan Boys High School, he became exposed to the teachings of Reverend Dr. James Emmanuel Kwegri Agre, a book which Agre gave him, Negro Education, a study of the private and higher school for colored people in the United States, now directed his ambition towards America. Another book, From Log Cabin to the White House, a biography of President James Garfield, which was conferred on him as a prize by the school, now became the roadmap for his life and convinced him that he had to go to America. A speculative letter sent to the principal of Howard University in America earned him an introduction to Storer College and a promise of support with admission to the college, provided he could pay his way to America. Since his father had declared that he was unable to provide any financial assistance, he went to work as a clerk in the Treasury Department of the Colonial Service to raise some money for his adventure. His first attempt to leave Nigeria for America via Liverpool as a stowaway found him ending up only in Accra, where to keep body and soul together, he joined the Ghana police force. It was not long there before his mother tracked him down to deliver his father's plea for him to leave the job and return to Nigeria with a promise that he would help fund his journey to America. His father had become converted to his cause after a racial insult from a young colonial officer colleague had made the older Azikiwe realize the limitations of his own position as a civil servant. The incident, having affected the older Azikiwe's health and pushed him into taking early retirement from the service, he now handed over 300 pounds from his life savings with his blessings to his young Azikiwe to go to America in pursuit of education and success. Azikiwe left Nigeria in 1925 to enroll at Storer College. There, living the Black American experience, he became immersed in the story of the slave trade, abolition, the American Civil War, and the civil rights struggle. At college, he excelled in his studies and in sports as a pentathlete, a boxer. However, soon after completing his studies at Storer, in June 1927, He found himself unemployed. He found himself unemployed, on the edge of starvation and attempting suicide on a train line. Azikiwe wrote, 4 weeks had passed since I lost my job, and no new job was in sight. By now, I was worth 1 dime in all the world. I had rationed my funds so frugally that I went on a diet for a long time, and at times had 1 meal a day. When no job was coming, I reduced this to a cup of coffee and 2 thick slices of bread, but it was in vain. By this act, he had given notice that he had no use for his life. He was rescued from the path of the train at the last minute, by a passerby who took him to the Pittsburgh YMCA. There, he came under the influence of Reverend Dr. A.M. Lamb, a white Presbyterian minister. Placing his aged hand on my head, he said to me, "It is the unseen hand of providence that saved you early this morning and brought me here, my son." In America, Azikiwe did every low job imaginable to pay his way, including sweeping, dishwashing, coal mining, and working as a road laborer and lift operator in between repeated bouts of unemployment. Despite all his hard work, he had to leave Howard University with his studies unfinished because he owed tuition fees. It was only after more toil and struggle that he was able to gain admission into Lincoln University to finally finish his first degree before enrolling at Columbia University to study journalism. Once again, though he ran out of money and had to drop out of Columbia, he returned to Lincoln, which gave him a teaching assistantship to pay for his studies. Finally, he returned to Columbia to enroll for a PhD in political science. It was the hard experience of his life in America which led him to the following admission in the preface to his autobiography. "Since attaining manhood, I have had to fend for myself in a world where idealism and materialism are usually opposed to each other. In the course of my life's odyssey, I have been convinced that I must be idealistic to justify my existence as a human being, but I must also be materialistic to adapt myself to the concatenations of a materialistic world. To steer between these two, it became necessary for me to be eclectic and pragmatic, to draw the best from each philosophy and make it work to my advantage in the light of reason and experience." From Azikiwe's varied life experiences, his upbringing in the north, west, and east of Nigeria, one might have expected that he would have become Pan-Africanist in political outlook and a one Nigerian man. The external influence which turned him into a jingoist champion of Igbo ethnic group lies at the heart of the Nigerian disaster story and tragedy which was to befall his people. So Governor Bernard Bodilon. I will continue that, but I need a quick tea break. So I think we are like deeply in, and from what I have here, we still have like about 15 to 20 pages left. But I'll take a tea break. Okay. But the also don't tell. They don't take away our ancestors also. A lot of us are hustling. And today, we probably have no idea what the future holds for all of us now. Because if you take a look at it, the only difference is that those who were the educated natives before independence of Nigeria, their education and their motivation for independence was came through their exposure when they became students in Europe, here, especially in Britain. They met other educated natives from the empire, the colonies of Britain, who came here to school. And they used that sort of education, right, to kick off a movement that indeed changed the course of the histories of their countries. Today, Nigerians are using education just to run away from Nigeria. People are selling their properties just to get student visa because they want to escape from Nigeria. And when they finish with the education, they don't want to go back to that place. Do you see the contrast? So we have seen those of us who are now like in the diaspora too, politically conscious, completely against the status quo of what is happening in Nigeria. So we do not know what the future holds for us. You get what I mean? But yet, there is something for us in that future. So keep going. And that's why we need to educate a lot of us, so that when the destiny of millions of people falls on your lap, on your laps, right? You would have been adequately educated, enlightened, to understand that, you see, it is just a call of responsibility. It is not an opportunity to further enslave them. With clarity and a better education, historical like this, we expect that generations who knows the era of those men of the past, what they went through and what they achieved and what they failed to achieve, we could be writing or reading your own history in another 50 years' time. And yeah, it's because it's going to happen, right? Good. So let us now continue. Governor Bernard Bodilon. The high-level thinking on future colonial policy in Africa and on the future of the Nigerian colony in particular was underway even as World War II and the negotiations for African entry into the war were going on. Those tasked with the responsibility were Marjorie Perham and Bernard Bodilon. The former was Frederick Lugard's biographer. The latter was his disciple, whose influence on the internal political configuration of Nigeria was almost as great as the influence that Goldie and Lugard had on the country's external boundaries. To say that Bodilon walked in the footsteps of Lugard is no exaggeration. Like him, he had started his colonial service in India, where Lugard had first acquired his taste for indirect rule, before, like Lugard, moving to Uganda to take up his first governorship appointment. As Lugard had done in his own time, it was from Uganda that he arrived as governor of Nigeria in 1935 to take over from Cameroon. Lugard began the process of extending indirect rule to the south, but it was Bodilon who completed it. Under the system, the educated natives' political participation would be tempered by the influence of the traditional rulers, with the native authorities serving as a form of electoral college in selecting candidates for the representative assemblies. In both India and Sri Lanka, he had witnessed what the Lugardists considered to be the intoxication effects on colonial subject of missionary education. His comments on education policy, which he first articulated while governor of Uganda, were straight out of the Lugard manual. He wrote, education, he argued, had to be built slowly and upon a secure foundation of primary teachings, biased towards agriculture, while too much secondary education was a positive menace. Purely academic teachings would not, in his opinion, help to produce national character, while a too rapid spread of higher education would overstock the employment market and yield a large crop of discontented unemployables who produce all sorts of political troubles and do no good to themselves or the country. Much better to concentrate on providing elementary education for all. He was, as his biographer depicted him, a 20th century colonialist. His thinking was in terms of how to strengthen and sustain the British Empire rather than how to bring it to an end. He believed that Britain would be ruling Nigeria for several more generations. And at the outset, his aim was to put in place a model of government that would secure Nigeria's position within the empire for the foreseeable future. Essentially, the plan was for a slow and protracted introduction of democratic practices to the south to keep the educated natives at bay whilst devising special arrangements for the north that would protect and preserve the feudal order and the pact with the Fulani. It was a race against time. At its core, it was simply the revival of the plan that had been aborted earlier, following Lugard's first departure in 1919. The mission was to perfect the unconsummated amalgamation of 1914 by creating a united Nigeria. Bodilon was determined to succeed where his mentor had failed in the endeavor to make the switch from direct to indirect rule in southern Nigeria. It was during the 1937-38 that, true to his policy of gradually improving what existed, he took the decision to introduce indirect rule in the colony area of Nigeria, the colony comprising Lagos itself and the districts rather of Badagry, Epe, and Ikeja. This time, the unity was to be a unity of institutions. Method and policies are not simply a union in person of the governor. As a minimum, it meant a shared model of governance for North and South and a common education policy. In both respects, it was the practices prevailing in the North that were to be applied in the South and not vice versa. A battle of wits now ensued between the educated natives, determined to make it through to the promised land, and the defenders of the empire, equally determined to keep them out. In 1937, Marjorie Peram urged that officialdom persevere in the development and modernization of the native authority system, and that the educated elements be integrated into that system, but she cautioned against admitting them to the central superstructure or giving them any further powers in the Legislative Council. If there was any daylight to be found between Bodilon and Lugard, it was only in their method. While the latter, the soldier, had sought to achieve the policy objective by direct confrontation with the educated natives, Bodilon went about the same objective using more slippery art of diplomacy, earning great acclaim for the relationship that he cultivated in the process. His tactic was to make some concessions to the native contribution to the war effort in some of the constitutional reforms. Thus, whilst prior to the war, the policy had been one of complete exclusion of the educated natives from central and local governments. So, two educated Africans, Sir Adeyemo Alakija and Justice S.B. Rhodes, were appointed to the Governor's Executive Council in 1943, but both were considered by the nationalists to be safe government men. Before 1943, no African had participated directly in policy formulation at the central executive level. Furthermore, with few exceptions, Africans were excluded from the various functional councils and boards appointed by the government to advise on specific problems. While Lugard had sought to keep the troublesome elements at arm's length and to browbeat them, Bodilon drew them close. It was a masterful public relation exercise bordering on a confidence trick. He promised dialogue, actively courted their society, and provided material support at opportune moments to key players who were prepared to accept the offered hand. He is reported to have helped Azikiwe's publication, West African Pilots Secure New Offices, in February 1939, after it had been evicted from his Broad Street premises. So skillfully did Bodilon play this hand that he won the radical groups over completely. So in a mere 15 months, he had helped to lay secure foundations of goodwill and cooperation between the colonial authorities and the Nigerian youth movement, an organization which had become unquestionably the main focus of Nigerian nationalism when it achieved electoral success for the first time. Members of the NYM now sat on its legislative council, which they might have been expected to keep their distance from, and in 1937, he became a patron of the London-based West African Students' Union. On 29 October 1938, Bodilon was meeting with the NYM to talk about Hitler's demand for territory in Africa. His popularity amongst those who were supposed to be leading the battle against colonial governments, of which he was the first representative, was summed up in the following passage, in quote: "The NYM declared that Sir Bernard was a sportsman and a gentleman, and on the eve of his departure on leave on 19th May 1938, around 400 members held a torchlight procession to Government House to bid him farewell. An unprecedented event, not simply in Nigeria, but in the whole of British Africa. And it was around this time that the pork pie art, which the governor habitually wore, started to become remarkably popular. It was known and sold as the Bodilon. Nobody should be without one. Ran the advertisement, and very soon nobody was. The fundamentals of Bodilon's covert scheme to keep the educated natives from power had been decided upon in 1937, although the implementation of the main planks only began in 1939, following Bodilon's publication of his memorandum on the future political development of Nigeria. Even though he avoided consulting with the educated natives on the proposals in the memorandum, he was not without opposition from those who he did not consult. Ironically, the most vociferous opponent of the proposal was a Briton, Theodore Samuel Adams, the chief commissioner for the northern provinces, 1936 to 1943, who had the reputation for being a rabid anti-Southerner, drawing upon his experiences in Malaya and the failed effort to fuse Chinese and Malay people into one community. Adams saw the two societies, North and South, as being too different to make any attempt to unify them, meaningful, let alone sustainable. Just as the differences between the colony of the Strait settlement and the Malay state has necessitated separate legislatures and local finance, the possibility of these different units coming more closely together is a possibility only and in one of the last stages in a remote development. For several generations in Nigeria too, one should look on the various parts as united in the governor and no other authority. But Bodilon had strategies to ensure that the Chinese domination of the Malays would not be replicated in Nigeria by Southern domination of Northerners. Promoting division in the South. While Yoruba and Fulani antipathy can be traced to the 1804 jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio, the difficulties between the Yoruba and the Igbo are of more recent genesis. excuse me, as the two nations share no borders or pre-British colonial interaction, the enmity is entirely the product of the politics of the period between the build-up to the Second World War and independence in 1960. Its beginning can be pinpointed to the action taken by Governor Bodilon on the 1st April 1939, when he reserved the amalgamation of eastern and western provinces of Nigeria that had created one South and which had been in effect since 1906. The measure had not been precipitated by any agitation for the division from the people of the Southeast or Southwest. It was also devoid of any intrinsic logic, since the South was territorially smaller than the North, had fewer ethnic groups, and was almost wholly Christian. Despite the warm and constructive relationship he had with the Nigerian youth movement, involving dialogue and consultation over many issues, there is no evidence that Bodilon consulted them on this critical issue of reversal of the Southern amalgamation. They claim that Nigeria falls naturally into three regions: the North, the West, and the East, made by Bodilon's successor, Sir Arthur Richards, was pure sophistry, which contradicted every scholarly comment on record on the point. M.O. Awa, in his book, Federal Government in Nigeria, cites the writing of Lord Haley, Marjorie Perham, Lord Lugard, and Bernard Bodilon himself in evidence against the notion. The scheme of amalgamation by E.D. Morel, had proposed in 1911, saw a Nigeria of four regions: two in the north, the northern and the central province, and two in the south, the western and the eastern province. Bodilon's biographer, Robert D. Pierce, conscious of the charge that his man deliberately fractured an existing consensus in southern Nigeria, whilst leaving the north as one, makes an attempt to defend his man when he wrote, "To concentrate on Bodilon's decision not to divide the north in 1937 is to sensationalize the issue. His actions ought to be judged in relation to the needs of the time rather than unpredictable future consequences." The weakness in the argument is that the decision was to reflect upon the need of the southern Nigerians. More importantly, the future consequences of the omission to split the north in the same way, far from being unpredictable, were in fact known, and the move was drawn directly from British experience in India, which had been a British colony for much longer than Nigeria, and where the nationalist campaign for independence was much further advanced. So here is the Indian precedent. Give me a sec. I've got something to put up there, but I think I'll do that later. So India precedents. Just a moment. Right. Oh my. In India, as in Nigeria, there were two principal stakeholders, stakeholder groups rather, divided on religious lines. In India, it was the Hindus and the Muslims, while in Nigeria, it was the Christians and the Muslims. In keeping with the empire's general policy of keeping interference with Islamic ways to a minimum, Western education had been extended only to the Hindus, who consequently were at the vanguard of the agitation for independence, as with the Yoruba in Nigeria. It was the Hindus of Bengal, seat of the then capital of British India, Calcutta, who had been identified as the most vocal. In 1905, the British Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, had implemented a partition measure to divide and distract the chasing pack of Indian nationalists. So this was what Curzon wrote. As the largest, most populous, and most troublesome administrative unit in British India, Bengal posed a worthy challenge. With a population twice that of Great Britain, which was predominantly Hindu in the West and Muslim in the East, the administrative case for a division of the two brokered little argument. Curzon therefore pushed ahead. He was not unimpressed by the view that Bengal's highly vocal critics would also thereby be partitioned. Although the partition of Bengal was reversed in 1911, by then the damage had been done to the common front which had been emerging between Muslims and Hindu nationalists against British rule. From this point on, Muslim nationalists who had worked side by side with Hindu nationalists within the Congress Party felt the need for a party of their own separate from what was now being depicted and perceived as a Hindu-dominated Congress Party. Within 2 years of the partition in Bengal, the All India Muslim Conference was convened, which led to the creation of a political party by the same name. The separation was compounded by elections in India in 1937, in which the British introduced the concept of separate electorates and reserved seats to give maximum recognition to the now separate Islamic political voice in the Hindu-dominated country. Once such political identities are awakened in the struggle for power, they cannot be easily put to rest again. Though this process of imperial political engineering, the Congress Party, which had historically been the party of all Indians, of all communities, and transcending all religious differences, became the party of the Hindus. The Muslim League became the party of the Muslims. Bodilon, having started his colonial service in India in 1908, at a time when the effects of the 1905 Bengal partition were still unfolding, and having left in 1918, some years after the attempted reversal of the partition, would have had first-hand knowledge of the effect of such sectarian measures. It was this Machiavellian precedent from India, from British India, that was applied to Nigeria in 1939 to sow the seeds of division between the nationalists of southern Nigeria. The poisoning of the southern Niger. The new three-region structure was consolidated in the new constitution, which Governor Richards introduced in 1946. But the retreat to regionalism was only a measure to split the southern consensus. The end game remained a unified Nigeria. In fact, this measure represents not the division of one unit into three, but the beginning of the fusion of innumerable small units into three, and from this into one. The division of South having been implemented without consultation. Elections in 1946 and 1951 now served to crystallize the new divide, which had been introduced into the polity. The Nigerian youth movement was to the nationalists what the Indian National Congress had been to their counterparts in India. It had been intended as a secular organization for all Nigerians, regardless of ethnic and religious and linguistic differences. Just as the Congress Party in India had originally been the shared platform of the Muslim leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and the Hindu leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, and Pandit Nehru. So too, the NYM had boasted the heavyweight collective of Nnamdi Azikiwe, H.O. Davis, Obafemi Awolowo, and Anthony Enahoro. Having begun with so much promise, it suddenly died a complete death, with accusations and counter-accusations of tribalism. The allegation against Azikiwe, which led to him being summoned before the Central Executive Committee of the organization in October 1940 to explain why he should not be expelled, was that in his effort to galvanize and prepare his Igbo people for the post-colonial age that was dawning, he had overstepped the line of what was acceptable to the nationalist cause. But Dr. Azikiwe went about it in a manner which disgusted those of us who were used to describing citizens of Nigeria as Nigerians or Africans, and regarding their achievement as reflecting credit on Nigeria, indeed Africa, as a whole. The following are typical of titles of front-page news item and editorial articles in the pilots. Igbo young man to sail to UK is the heading of a front-page story and picture on September 23, 1938. The young man is Mr. Jaja Wachuku, now Speaker of Nigeria's House of Representatives. 2. 14th West African student, 10th Nigerian, 8th Igbo in USA. Another front page story on January 28, 1939. The 8th Igbo is Mr. Nwafo Orizu, now Senator in Nigeria's upper house. 3. Igbo medical student passes exam in first-class honors. Yet another page story on June 26, 1940, of the brilliant success of Dr. Eso Eguatu. 4. Editorials. 1. A model union, August 8, 1938, in praise of the Ibibio State Union. 1 year ago, August 18, 1938, celebrating the first anniversary of the call to the bar of the first Igbo lawyer, in the person of Mr. Justice Louis Mbanefo, now Chief Justice of the Eastern Nigeria High Court. 3. The Igbo are coming, December 31, 1938. The very title in sufficiently indicative of the contents. These are but a few examples of the publicity given to Igbos as a group, but as against this, the achievement of the Yorubas, and in particular, the academic laurels of their scholars received, if at all, inconspicuous notice in the pilot. However, to say that Azikiwe caused the breakup of the NYM after he started to promote a distinct Igbo nationalist agenda is to view the event from the ground level only. The timing and suddenness of the emergence of tribalism within the NYM has everything to do with the colonial government's agenda to divide and rule, because parallel developments can be seen within the Congress Party of India around the same time. But in 1938, Gina too foresaw the danger of a Congress Raj at the Federal Center. Accusations of Hindu discrimination against Muslims in the already Congress-run provinces were probably much exaggerated, but they received wide publicity. To the call of Islam in danger, the League began a drive for the mass support, which had hitherto eluded it. The League's claim to present the majority of Muslims at least began to acquire some substance. Azikiwe personally had no reason, neither on account of experience or ideology, to be anti-Yoruba. He had grown up as a Lagos boy, and it was to Yoruba colleagues and acquaintances that he had turned during his years of struggle. When making his preparations to enroll at Howard University, it was Baba Jimmy Adewakun, an outgoing student at Howard, to whom he reached out and who promised to hand over his job as a dishwasher on leaving to help him meet his board and lodging expenses. It was Akintunde Dikpeolu of the University of Chicago who inspired him to ditch his English name, Ben. It was Ladipo Sholanke in London, to whom he wrote in the autumn of 1929 when he needed a comforter. It was H.O. Davis, with whom he lodged while passing through London, and it was his boyhood hero, Herbert Macaulay, with whom he sought employment in the Lagos Daily News when he was first trying to return to Nigeria from America. Again, it was H.O. Davis who worked with him as an unpaid organizing manager when he was starting his newspaper, the West African Pilot. Besides, having had such a high-level exposure to African-American political issues during the years of struggle in America, his ideology was rabidly Pan-Africanist. The first speech he delivered on his homecoming was full of Pan-Africanist enlightenment for his people. Azikiwe wrote or said, social regeneration implied the treatment of all Africans as brothers and sisters, irrespective of tribe, so as to crystallize a sense of oneness and identity of community interest. No longer should Africans draw a line of distinction based on tribal or linguistic factors, but they should appreciate the universal affinity of all African peoples. Yet, it was Azikiwe who, soon after joining the Nigerian youth movement, which had been birthed on ideals of oneness, began drawing very bold lines of distinction based on tribal or linguistic factors, culminating in the death of that organization. That this started around the same time that Jinnah started to play the sectarian card in India leads to the conclusion that the change in Azikiwe was due to influences beyond himself. The explanation is to be found in the ground which the Babylon was laying in the south for tribalism to germinate. Azikiwe's New Year resolution that Azikiwe, on his way back home after a 9-year sojourn in America, chose to spend the summer of 1934 in London, is not particularly remarkable, especially given the correspondence that he had been having with the West African Students' Union from America and with friends of his in London, like H.O. Davis, that in the course of that short stay in London, he ran into the empire's chief strategist for colonial policy, and later Lugard's biographer, Marjorie Perham, and spent a weekend at our country home in Abingdon, Berkshire. May have just been a happy coincidence. What followed cannot be so described. Azikiwe, in his autobiography, notes that Perham gave him special mention in a work, Native Administration in Nigeria, which was published in 1937, the same year as his formal entry into the Nigerian political stage, and the same year in which Babylon decided upon the reversal of the amalgamation of southern Nigeria. On page 361 of a book cited above, I detected a direct reference to me. He said, the ambitions of the educated should also be met by doing everything possible to find or create opportunities for them within the native administrations. This is not always easy. It is fortunate that the majority of the educated have hitherto been from the Yoruba country, where the local governments are large enough to employ some, at least, of their more civilized members. But what scope, to quote a recent example, can the rudimentary Igbo group offer to one of the tribe who has spent 10 years at American University accumulating academic qualifications. By the time of this encounter in London with Miss Perham, Nnamdi Azikiwe had become disillusioned with life. In 1930, renewed money problems had forced him to abandon his PhD program at Columbia and returned home. He calculated that his prospect at home as a pioneer of the new educated Igbo elite would be better than whatever he could hope to achieve in America. Before he set off, he sent various applications for employment in Nigeria. What he met was a concrete wall of unemployment. He had applied for work to the education department and the police department of the colonial administration and to the newspapers and the various Christian missions. He had applied to the Nigerian banks and finance companies for a loan to start his own newspaper, all to no avail. He had scaled all obstacles to attain the highest level of education and an appointment as a lecturer in political science in America, only to find himself unemployable in his own homeland. The stark reality was that under a colonial regime, occupied with calculations on prolonging his hold on his colonies, educated natives, particularly those tutored in political science in America, the first rebel colony of the empire, were the least desirables of all undesirables. What was now apparent to Azikiwe was that colonial government controlled virtually all the gateways to employment in Nigeria, which his education led to. So Azikiwe, the scar of 1776 American independence was to be likened to the differences between two friends, like China, where it might be patched up, but it was always visible. The scar of 1776 was the price the African who was educated in America was bound to pay for having dared to proceed to America, where one could imbibe the spirit of 1776. Even an attempt to get employment with the Ethiopian and Liberian governments, the latter being a country on which he had become something of an authority whilst teaching in America, soon brought home to him the realities of his Pan-Africanist ideals. The realization that he was a foreigner, even in Africa, led him to make the following resolution before leaving America to set his value system. On the last day of the year 1933, the realities of unemployment inspired me to make a New Year resolution in the form of a solemn vow made up of 5 points. Here is the text. Azikiwe wrote this, so his New Year resolution in 1934. He wrote this at the end of the year 1933, since he couldn't find any job anywhere. So he made a resolution, 5. He said, having ardently sought for the opportunity to better my lot in life, having bravely crossed the Atlantic Ocean in quest of knowledge and wisdom, having passed through the crucible of unemployment and worked hard as an unskilled laborer and a menial worker, having worked and whistled my way through university, partly because of my faith, perseverance, and diligence, and partly on account of the charitable disposition of kind-hearted human beings. Having succeeded in realizing my dreams for academic honors because of my supreme determination, resoluteness, and willpower, in spite of man-made handicaps and other imponderables of human life, I, Benjamin Nnamdi Azikiwe, hereby make this solemn vow before God and man. First, that henceforth I shall dedicate my life to the emancipation of the continent of Africa from the shackles of imperialism and to the redemption of my country from the manacles of foreign rule. Secondly, that in order to earn an honest living henceforth, I shall devote my energies either to work on my own or to work for others, with the sole aim of accumulating wealth to ensure that I shall never be in want. Thirdly, that I shall utilize my earned income to secure my enjoyment of a high standard of living and also to give a helping hand to the needy. Fourthly, that henceforth I shall be charitably disposed towards all human beings and do all I can to be philanthropic, so as to make life less irksome for the underprivileged. Finally, that henceforth I shall strive to my utmost to live as a true Christian, forgiving those who offend me, forgetting the evils perpetrated against me, and praying fervently to God to forgive my sins and to forget my shortcomings. Made at Houston Hall, Lincoln University, December 31, 1933. After so many years of honest endeavor to improve himself, he had come full circle to what seemed a life with no future. He was effectively back to the point of helplessness which had driven him to his earlier suicide attempt. The only escape that opened to him from his desperate state was an opportunity in the Gold Coast, Ghana, to help establish a new newspaper, the African Morning Post. He was driven to bare his soul in an exchange of correspondence with one Dr. Thomas Jesse Jones, educational director of the Phelps Stokes Fund, to whom he wrote to announce his plan to return to Africa. I have come to the end of the road. My immediate aim is to aid in bringing about mutual understanding between the people of Nigeria and the British government and mission in Nigeria. It might be of advantage to join hands with the efforts of the government and the missions. This seems to be practicable because such a connection should benefit the Africans. In the past, I must confess that I had doubted the possibility of such a program. Probably the flame of youth was responsible. But with the passing of the years and as one grows older, it becomes evident that the only practical and workable way is the cooperation of the kind advocated by the later Booker T. Washington. I sincerely believe that I will cooperate fully and can be used as a means of better understanding between the indigenous Africans of my country and the various agencies of the British government and the mission in Nigeria. Azikiwe's admission of defeat in his personal struggle against the British colonial powers and his declaration of his new readiness to work with them formed the basis of his emergence as the political leader of the Eastern region, and goes to explain the special relationship that developed between Azikiwe, the British, and the Fulani political leaders of the North. Through Peram's agency, Azikiwe, whilst still in London, in quick succession had meetings with Sir William Edgar Hunt, the Lieutenant Governor of the Southern Provinces, Major Hans Visca, formerly Director of Education for the Northern Provinces of Nigeria, and with the Colonial Office team. What seemed to have happened is that Peram and our friends implanted a fear of Yoruba domination of post-colonial Nigeria into Azikiwe's mind, in much the same way as they were to implant the fears of Southern domination in the minds of the Northern political leadership to steer them into competition. The British side wasted no time in delivering on their part of the bargain to make Azikiwe leader of the Igbos, with the mission of arousing and uniting them into a political force to compete with the Yorubas. Heralded as the first indigenous Igbo graduate, ahead of his homecoming into Nigeria, arrangements had been put in place for the Committee of Igbo Gentlemen in Lagos and across the East to prepare welcoming parties at which the dawn of a new era in educational and cultural aspirations of the rising generation of the Igbo country and Nigeria would be proclaimed before audiences ranging from 10,000 in Onitsha to 20,000 in Calabar. In Port Harcourt, the chairman of the occasion was Reverend L.R. Potts Johnson. In Enugu, it was Reverend A.W. Howells, while in Aba, it was Mr. S.I. Simon. At each gathering, what Azikiwe called a heavy pause was given to him. The one that took place on 26 November 1934 at the Masonic Hall in Onitsha was a special one for non-native African residents of Onitsha, where he was enjoined to aim for the accomplishment of the prayer of the Christ, that all may be one. With his degrees in political science and with the speaking opportunities that had been arranged for him by his new friends in the Colonial office. Hang on. Okay, sorry, one second. There's something on there that shouldn't. So I'll take it out. Man, let's continue. So they say with his degree, or hang on, I'll take it up, I'll take that paragraph again. With his degrees in political science and with the speaking opportunities that had been arranged for him by his new friends in the Colonial office, by the end of his tour of the Igbo country in November 1934, Azikiwe was the undisputed political leader of the Igbos and the main political figure in the Eastern region. The Pan-Africanists had been turned into an ethnic champion, to the extent that he spoke against tribalism. Was aimed at the need for unity of. So here is what he said. He said, I welcome the two Igbo delegations and informed them that, first and foremost, I was a son of humanity and a citizen of the world. I submitted that my place of birth was an accident. Neither Onitsha, nor Nigeria, nor Africa could correctly claim me because I was of the earth and I belong to the earth, irrespective of geographical and other man-made boundaries. But I did not want to be too idealistic in my view of the mission of man in the world. So I asked them what were the tribal affinities of their constituencies. They replied that they were all Igbo-speaking people. Then I questioned why a house should be divided against itself. Following this tour of the Igbo nation, Azikiwe left Nigeria to take up his job with the Morning Post in Accra, where he would learn his trade in political journalism. Controversy soon followed him as he was castigated as a bird of passage who had nothing at stake in Ghana but to pit brother against brother. At the public gathering at the Native Court Hall, Onitsha, back in November 1934, before his departure for Accra, there was one speaker of special significance whom Azikiwe refers to as his friend, counselor and guide. The man, John Murray Stuart Young, was a homosexual, a pedophile, a master forger, and an ex-convict. For all these reasons, he had been an outcast from English society but now he was a pillar of society in Azikiwe's hometown, Onitsha, where he lived for over 50 years before his death. His body remains buried there. Stuart Young had relocated to Nigeria in 1905 to reinvent himself, and he did so to great effect, including awarding himself the academic title of Dr. John Morris Stuart Young. Even though he had never been to university, starting out in the palm oil trade in Onitsha as a common palm oil ruffian, he soon became one of the richest European traders in Nigeria. This spectacular rise from a poor white to merchant prince gave him the means to indulge his passion from his home, the quaintly named the Little House of No Regrets, New Market Road, Onitsha. First among his passion was his passion for young boys. Several local historians and senior men in Onitsha testified to Stuart Young's passionate lifelong interest in young African men. He subsidized and sponsored many local youth during his 30 years in the town. He advised and trained several bright boys in clerical skills, and he offered employment and accommodation to other youth before and after their marriages. In this way, he built up an extensive network of proteges and manservants in Onitsha. It was a passion for the indulgence of which Mr. Stuart Young has been expected to have been stoned to death in Igbo country. But not only was he a white man in colonial Nigeria, but he was one who had been adopted by Onitsha society as one of their own. His death on 28th May 1938 was mourned throughout the papers of the Eastern region, with his funeral being attended by thousands. Azikiwe himself led the tribute. In the West African pilot, Azikiwe takes charge of producing his friend's memory and reconstruct him as the exemplar of a hoped-for post-coloniality, a leader of Renaissance Africa, and a model to Nigerian youth. I wonder if the people of Onitsha would have the same sense of duty and admiration for this white friend of the blacks, he wrote. To erect a monument dedicated to the sacrifice of this hero, to the cause of interracial cooperation, and thus make the tomb of Odeziaku a national shrine. Wow. Wow. I told you, our ancestors, they are not all heroes, they are not all villains. They were actually men, ordinary men, like you and me. And that is why you should never be the prisoner of your own history. Don't be. Be a student of history, learn from all of their mistakes, and make sure that if you have a chance, you never repeat them. That's how you can kill all this part of the dark part of the history. I promise you. But let us continue. Interestingly, on his return, in his role as the Igbo champion, Azikiwe chose to join the Nigerian youth movement rather than to set up his own group. That by October 1940, he was being summoned by the group to a disciplinary hearing on charges of violations of the group's fundamental ideals, suggests that he joined the group to break it up. By this time, the restraining influence of Odeziaku, who had preached the brotherhood of man and our oneness, our identity, our common humanity, on Azikiwe was no more. Even though members of the organization persuaded Azikiwe to withdraw the resignation from the group, which he had tendered in protest at the hearing, the damage had been done. On 20th February 1941, he used the medium of his West African pilot to announce his resignation from the Nigerian youth movement, thereby signaling a formal parting of ways between East and West amongst the nationalists. In the aftermath of the fallout amongst the nationalists within the NYM, In 1942, H.O. Davies accepted a job as marketing officer with the colonial government, which the NYM had been at the vanguard of campaigning against. In 1943, Azikiwe signaled the formal end of the nationalist consensus and the beginning of ethnic-based political associations when he launched the Igbo Federal Union with himself as its president. Obafemi Awolowo responded to the development by forming Egbe Omo Oduduwa in London in 1945. These developments effectively marked the death of the NYM, an attempt to revive the organization as a joint council under the leadership of the elder statesman, Herbert Macaulay, so as to form a united front against the nationalists to negotiate a post-war deal with the colonial authorities was again frustrated by Azikiwe's intervention. The joint council was formed, and the parties agreed to share representations on the Legislative Council and on the Lagos Town Council. In September 1943, 1 month after Azikiwe, dejected and embittered, returned from England, Macaulay resigned from the Joint Council. This ended the first effort to achieve a national front. The Nigerian youth movement died a complete death when Davies and Awolowo both left Nigeria in 1944 to study law in England, returning in 1947 and 1948, respectively. The stage was set to Azikiwe, who, in the same year, 1944, moved to establish the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, as the main opposition voice of nationalism, with Herbert Macaulay, then age 80, as the president of the party. The appointment was shrewd as 2 years later, on 7th May 1946, the old voice of Lagos politics died while on a tour of the country with the NCNC. His funeral in Lagos was the largest in Nigeria history, with more than 100,000 in attendance, with Azikiwe delivering the eulogy personally, and then succeeding him as the president of the NCNC. The legacy of Macaulay's Lagos political base was firmly in NCNC hands. The Macaulay legacy, coupled with the special situation of Lagos being part of Yoruba land, but also as the national capital, being populated by many from other regions, now gave the NCNC a credible foothold in Lagos. Nevertheless, Azikiwe did, with British help, deliver on his primary mission of arousing and inspiring the Igbos into competition with the Yorubas. Village Improvement Union sponsored scholarships, and Igbo students flocked to secondary schools in what is now the Western region. By late 1930s, the Igbos were more heavily represented than any other tribe or nationality in Yaba Higher College and in most Nigerian secondary schools. Thenceforward, the number of Igbos appointed to the African civil service and as clerks in the business firm increased at a faster rate than that of any other group. By 1945, the gap between Yorubas and Igbos was virtually closed. Increasing numbers of Igbo barristers and doctors began to arrive from England. By 1952, the number of Igbos, 115, enrolled at University College, Ibadan, was nearly equal to the number of Yorubas, 118. But the effort came at a cost in East-West relations, which worsened progressively. By the summer of 1948, when Awolowo returned from his law studies in London, rivalry was bordering on conflict. We were bunched together by the British, who named us Nigeria. We never knew the Igbos, But since we came to know them, we have tried to be friendly and neighborly. Then came the arch-devil to sow the seeds of distrust and hatred. We have tolerated enough from a class of Igbos and Adu-brained Yorubas who have mortgaged their thinking caps to Azikiwe and his hirelings, Awolowo said. The rejoinder from the Igbos through Azikiwe's West African pilot was no less guttural. Azikiwe responded, henceforth, the cry must be one of battle against Egbe Omodudua, its leaders at home and abroad, uphill and down Dale in the street of Nigeria and in the residence of his advocates. It is the enemy of Nigeria. It must be crushed to the earth. There is no going back until the fascist organization of Sir Adeyemo has been dismembered. The climax of Azikiwe's progress was in his 1949 address, following his election as president of the Igbo State Union. Azikiwe said, "It would appear that the God of Africa has specially created the Igbo nation to lead the children of Africa from bondage of ages. The martial prowess of the Igbo nation at all stages of human history has enabled them not only to conquer others, but also to adapt themselves to the role of preserver. The Igbo nation cannot shirk its responsibility." British did a great work. They did a great work of dividing us, and this tribal something, they actually did a very, very great work to destroy us. About Azikiwe, where some people they see as hero, it was a complete tool in the hand of the British. Yeah. Let's continue again. Your heroes. When you begin to look at the real history, those they claim to be our heroes past, or villains, when you start looking at them, they are not what they told us they were. All of them. But let's continue. The South would never again be united under a simple political umbrella. Since then, well, let us continue. Promoting unity in the North, the same British show that planted the division in the South. Okay? They were promoting unity, but it's a different kind of unity. They were promoting in the North. So let's continue. Promoting unity in the North. If Bodilon's handiwork is stirring up ethnic rivalry and political competition between the Igbos and the Yoruba, has to be inferred and deduced from events and circumstances. What it did to build political unity in the North and to play the thus united Northern team against the now divided South is a matter of written confession by the man on the ground who made it all happen, Sir Brian Sherwood Smith, the Lieutenant Governor of Northern Nigeria up to independence. In his 1970 memoir, But Always as Friends, Northern Nigeria and the Cameroons, 1921 to 1957, Sherwood Smith gives a comprehensive account of the evolution of the British relationship with the North, first as masters, then as leaders, finally as partners. He wrote, in the Britain of 1951, the northern region of Nigeria was little but a name. Nigeria, to the interested, was the Nigeria of the South with its eloquent political leaders, its clamant press, its academic links with the United Kingdom, its university graduates and its students' unions. The North, to the few who were aware of its existence, was still a stagnant backwater, quaintly feudal or incorrigibly archaic. According to the viewpoint of the individual, few in Britain seem to realize that in the crucible of nationalist politics, a new north had been born, and that its leaders now faced a challenge to sow their hunting that they needed all the sympathy and encouragement they could get. For public opinion in Britain to refuse that sympathy, either out of ignorance or from political bigotry, seemed to us to be morally wrong. It would also be politically stupid. There were Muslim states and communities in other parts of Africa, Egypt, for instance, whose attitude towards all we in Britain stood for was the reverse of friendly, of the goodwill. Now ours to help them further policies that would not at this stage benefit the people for whom we are still responsible. Why also risk Nigerian unity by antagonizing the more stable and more administratively experienced half of the country? The lessons from India in the aftermath of the First World War had been well learned, not least that excluding the educated natives from the administration of the country was a policy with a limited shelf life. The only way to avoid the country coming under the control of the much feared and despised nationalists was to abandon the policy of screening the North from political interaction with the South. However, that policy, having been the orthodoxy for so long, special effort was going to be required, first to persuade the Northern leaders to buy into the need for engagement with the South, and beyond that, to avoid Southern rule, as had been done with Azikiwe and the Igbos. The plan was to fast-track the North preparation to meet the challenge by using the fear of the Southern domination as their spur to action. It was this policy that ultimately led to the military coup of 1966 and the Biafra War. The rousing of the North. As with this unity of the South, the real groundwork for the Bodilon plan for building unity in the North began in 1939, when the Barewa College Old Boys Association met in Kaduna and began to espouse the idea of one North. Also, Bodilon's biographer noted that his policy in the North took on a new urgency and directness as from 1942. So, Bodilon's biographer wrote, Bodilon told his officers bluntly that the emirs would have to be democratized and a place found for educated Africans in Northern Native administration for the next few years were likely to be of supreme importance in the political history of this country. Bodilon had at last taken off the kid gloves he had been using since 1937. Why had he changed his attitude? And why indeed had it taken so long to do so? There are several answers. In suggesting answers to these questions, the biographer omitted the most important, which was that the timelines that Bodilon had been working to had to be radically shortened following the publication of the Atlantic Charter in August 1941 and the loss of Singapore and Malaya to the Japanese in the spring of 1942. These events, combined with the weakening grip on India, made the thinking on Nigeria more critical. The new note of urgency manifested in Bodilon's publication of a further memorandum on the future political development of Nigeria in October 1942, which followed a tour of the North that Bodilon embarked upon to solicit the views of the British colonial officers in the region about how the North could be effectively unified with the South without the nationalists taking control. It was about this time that Sir Bernard Bodilon went on tour in the North, invited senior administrative officers to set out, quite informally and with complete frankness, what their personal views were on the future political development of Nigeria. He especially wished to know what we thought could be could be done to break the isolationist attitude of the North and make it one with Nigeria as a whole. Among other points that he made was his conviction that it was high time that Nigerians were admitted to the administrative service. What would be the attitude of the chiefs to such a step? My own personal reaction to the general question, I remember, was that there was no point in arguing that the North and South were interdependently economically and politically. Still less was it any use telling the Northern chiefs and people that if they wanted to preserve their own traditional way of life, they must accept the South and learn to meet it on reasonable equal terms, instead of pretending that it did not exist. Logic had no part in the problem, nothing short of a biological shock, such as maybe the introduction of a few Southern DOs would persuade them of the danger. Sir Bernard Bodilon's conclusion, formed as the result of these inquiries pursued throughout Nigeria, would pave the way to the major constitutional changes which would be introduced 2 years later by his successor, Sir Arthur Richards. And it was to be these changes, or rather the invasion of the North by Southern politicians in reaction to them, that were to produce the biological shock that was so much needed. I still have, hang on, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 pages to go. And I have just 9 minutes. What do you think I should do? Should we just kind of like move it to tomorrow? Number one, we can't take any calls anymore. Or do you think I can read 9 pages in 9 minutes? Absolutely, absolutely not. I can't. Or else I'll just be like that, right? So we won't be taking any calls, okay? We've been here for almost 3 hours. I've been reading for almost 3 hours. And that's like 100 and, okay, I currently have like 170 minutes. So let's move it to tomorrow so that I don't exhaust myself too much. So I can go get... Martinelli said we should continue. Okay, you know what we're going to do? I've got 8 minutes now, okay? So I will read it. Now, you see, it's only like 8 pages. 8 pages to the end, right? So let me read it then and see what I do in 8 minutes. So here, Brian Sherwood Smith. What was intended to be the final solution to the problems of how to keep Nigeria out of the hands of the educated natives was a plan to groom and produce a new class of educated elites in the North, who would provide the essential link between Lugard's native authority system and the future national parliament. This new class, who were to bridge the past with the present, were the sons of the emirs and sultans. Since Barewa College had been established precisely for the purpose of promoting Northern unity by educating the sons of the elite from across the North in the one school, the exercise was a relatively easy one. The one likely obstacle to the implementation of Bodilon's plan, Theodore Adams, had been taken care of with the award of a knighthood in 1942, before leaving Nigeria in March 1943, destined for retirement. The way was now clear for Brian Sherwood Smith to rouse the North for political engagement with the South. Although his father was a parson's son and his mother was the daughter of a vicar, the high point of Sherwood Smith's career was to be the strengthening of the Islamic North against the Christian South. After military service in the First World War in France and India, he chose to join the colonial service in preference to going to Cambridge, where he quickly moved from district officer to governor of Northern Nigeria. Having arrived in Nigeria in January 1921, he only finally left the country in September 1957. Fluent in Hausa and with competent Fulani, he was the most trusted advisor of the Northern political leadership. Sherwood Smith knew the thinking of the Northern leaders that left to themselves, they had no appetite for a united or unified Nigeria. That within a united Nigeria, their only concern was to protect what they had and to avoid domination by the more educated South. But that if the South was seen to be moving to threaten their isolation, they would be forced to react. The NCNC's fundraising rallies in the North ahead of his mission to London were just the opportunity that Sherwood Smith was looking to exploit. See, Southern politicians were to be aired for the first time in the marketplaces of the North, or at least in the marketplaces of those towns that had large settlements of Igbos and Yorubas and other Southern tribes. And the Northern leaders were not to relish the experience, which more than anything else cured them of any surviving illusion that they could continue to ignore the world around them. All in all, the NCC delegation had done the North and the Nigeria as a whole a great service. The years of apathy were now ended. And though at the time, the contrary seemed the case, the road to a united Nigeria lay at last open. What remained was to put together the Northern team that was to be played against the Southern leaders. Sherwood Smith was responsible for the recruitment exercise. Ahmadu Bello. Ahmadu Bello's lineage traced directly back to the Fulani conquest of Hausa land, little more than a century before his birth in 1910. His great-grandfather, Sultan Bello, was one of the two sons of Uthman Dan Fodio, the leader of the jihad. Just a few years before Bello's birth, the British had invaded and conquered the Sokoto Empire. His uncle, the Sarkin Muslimi, commander of the faithful of Sokoto, Muhammad Atahiru I, had been killed in battle after refusing to come under British rule. His successor, Muhammad Atahiru II, Atahiru II, was more amenable, and Bello was of similar persuasion. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the attack on Kano and Sokoto may be, the British were the instrument of destiny and were fulfilling the will of God. In their way, they did it well. Even at the actual time, there was no ill will after the occupation. Ahmadu Bello, as the descendant of those who had established the Fulani Empire within the Nigeria space, was an obvious choice as leader of the Northern team. His father, who had worked as a district head in the system of native administration then prevailing in the North, died when he was 6, but his upbringing was nevertheless comfortable within the extended family network. Schools on the Western models prevailing in the South being unknown then, in his village, preschool education took the conventional form of instruction in Arabic and the study of the Quran. At the age of 10, he went to secondary school before attending Barewa College to train as a teacher. A keen sportsman, he enjoyed the English pastimes of cricket and Eton fives. In common with others from the North, who emerged from the Barewa College, he started life as a teacher before, in 1934, being appointed district head of his home district of Rabba. Bello was a reluctant recruit to the Nigerian political scene. The death of the reigning Sultan in 1938 had momentarily raised the prospect that he would fulfill his personal ambition of becoming the next Sultan. Alas, the development coincided with the rollout of Baudouin's plan for the North, in which had been scripted to occupy a different office. Ever since the British conquest of the Sokoto Empire, although the responsibility for choosing the new sultan and emirs rested with the traditional selectors. Their choice was subject to the veto of the chief representatives of the British government in the north, who at this time was Sherwood Smith. It was British who had, in fact, introduced the title Sultan, as they had done with the Alake in Egbaland, to establish a clear hierarchy within the community of chiefs. The two main candidates for the Sultanate were Bello and the Sardauna Abubakar, with Bello being the popular choice only for his selection to be trumped by British actions. According to the British, at this point, many apocryphal stories arise as to what happened. One of the most recurrent is that the Selection Council recommended Ahmadu. But when the decision was taken to the residents, John Carroll, he insisted that the succession as of right ought to go to the son of the Sultan. The council argued that Abubakar was not really the son of the Sultan, but his nephew. The resident replied with certainty that he had often heard the Sultan refer to Abubakar as his son, and that as his son, he was entitled to the succession. Abubakar III was selected as Sultan, and within a short period of time, his title of Sardauna is given to the runner-up, Ahmadu, who for all practical purposes then becomes known as Ahmadu, Sardauna of Sokoto. The British intervention changed the destiny of the two contenders. Abubakar will live a long life as Sultan, while Ahmadu Bello, the new Sardauna, will live a short, dramatic life as Premier of the North. As part of the preparation for his role, in 1948, the British Council arranged for him to visit England for a short course in local government. In contrast with the experience of the nationalists in the South, who had to fend for themselves while abroad, arrangements had been put in place for him to stay in the home of an English family while attending the course. In several other respects, his path to his destiny was cleared for him by decisive interventions by Sherwood Smith. The personal relationship between Ahmadu Bello and the new Sultan, Abubakar, was never good and was worsened by the fact that one of the first acts of the new Sultan was to sentence Bello to a term of imprisonment for 1 year following a conviction by the Sultan's court on charges of embezzlement, which he was only spared from serving on appeal to the British. The hostile relationship between the two leaders meant that in steering Bello through to his appointed political destiny, Sherwood Smith often had to force the issue. See, reading just 3 pages alone took me about 11 minutes. So I don't want to overstretch it. So once I finish this next part, I'm going to actually hold it here. So we'll continue from Ahmadu Bello. Let's continue from Ahmadu Bello's entrance into the scene tomorrow. So thank you so much once again, everyone. It's another is it called another boring afternoon or morning? History can be boring, and at the same time, it can be very, very intriguing. So nostalgic as well. I'll leave you all to it. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon. I will see you later while we prepare for the evening. Thank you very much and enjoy your afternoon.
Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ la mọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. làwa mọ̀ láwọn tó jódodo.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
Maiyegun ti dé o ọ̀rẹ́ ará ìlú.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
lórí Facebook lórí YouTube.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
gbogbo bó ṣe ń lọ ni Maiyegun já wa sí.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
àṣírí ọ̀jẹ̀lú kì í bò níbẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
bó bá ṣe eré àní Maiyegun máa wí.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
ó sì tún ṣe eré wàá gbọ́ níbẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
Maiyegun diary politico.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
Godfatherism kò sí lọ́rọ̀ Maiyegun.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
ẹ farabalẹ̀ sẹ́ o kẹgọ́rọ̀ lẹ́nu o.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
àní Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ tó jódodo.
Maiyegun diary Nayibi #1.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé. Maiyegun ti dé.
ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
lórí Facebook
Maiyegun ti dé.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
lórí YouTube
Maiyegun ti dé.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
bọ́ bàbá gbé wúrẹ́
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
ijó ìgbádìyẹ
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
pẹ̀sìdó bá rúfin o
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
kí gómìnà kówó jẹ
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
ọlọ́pàá tí ń gba rìbá
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
aṣòfin tí ń rúfin o
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
òpùrọ́ olóṣèlú
Maiyegun máa wí.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì
Maiyegun ti dé.
àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dèrò ní fi wọ́n níran o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
wọ́n fowó bẹ́ẹ̀ o Maiyegun ó sọ pé wọ́n ò bẹ́ẹ̀ wọ́n fowó bẹ́ẹ̀ Maiyegun ó sọ pé wọ́n ò bẹ́ẹ̀ oníkan ṣáàtì ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe fáwọn ará ìlú tó gbé wọn débẹ̀ o àyè.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
ha kì máa yí ṣe eré ọ̀rọ̀ yìí kì í ṣe ẹ̀fẹ̀ kì máa yí ṣe eré ọ̀rọ̀ yìí kì í ṣe ẹ̀fẹ̀ ẹni bá ti lè lẹ́bọ̀ lẹ́rù o ọmọ bá dèrò kàṣà ìtú wọn síta.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
tẹnitẹni ọmọ Maiyegun ọ̀rẹ́ ara ìlú mọ̀mọ́ ni ó fọlọ́hún ṣọ́ ẹ̀ bá kìlẹ́bù lóòótọ́ olódodo ìlú ọ̀tá ìlú mọ̀mọ́ ni ìwọ ṣá máa ń ṣọ́ra kò sì mọ́ bẹ̀rù bọ́tà ń lérí bóníṣègùn lé káwọn mọ̀mọ́ fi ṣera wọn ni ó ti dẹrùn tí wọn ò gbọ́dọ̀ sì mọ́ bẹ̀. èèpo ọ̀gọ̀ lọmọ bá dérò tàjẹ́ ò gbọ́dọ̀ jẹ́ ó ti dọba lórí àbínú ẹni kò sì mọ́ bùyà àìsíwọ́lu ní ẹnìkẹ́ ìgbódì ẹyin lábàrá o ó kó ẹni tó bá dán wò á kàmù Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì o ẹ̀yin bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dèrò òní fi wọ́n níran o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ òní fi wọ́n níran.